Peter Breggin, and this is another in my Simple Truths about psychiatry. And the subject today is that psychiatric drugs are much, much more dangerous than you've ever been led to believe by the doctors who are prescribing them. I genuinely believe that if most people knew how dangerous the psychiatric drugs really were, most people would never start on them. And I also believe that if most prescribers had even the faintest idea how dangerous they were, they'd stop prescribing them. Well, how is it that so many people can be ignorant about psychiatric drugs? Well, the truth is because they're all getting their information from the drug companies. I mean, when was the last time you saw a car company leap up to tell people way in advance that they'd had some deaths on the road from their bad brakes? When was the last time car companies went mea culpa and said, yes, our accelerators are sticking and running people down? Well, I can tell you the drug companies are even worse. They go to all kinds of extremes to avoid letting you know and letting your doctor know how dangerous the drugs are. I know this because I've been a medical expert in dozens of lawsuits against drug companies. I've looked inside drug companies and seen what they're really doing. I was appointed by a court in Indiana to be the scientific expert for over 150 lawsuits against Eli Lilly, suits alleging that the drug Prozac had caused violence, suicide, mayhem, mania, and psychosis. So I know what goes inside. I know as much as anyone about how dangerous the drugs are. Let's take a look at the stimulants that you may be taking as a college student or as a parent that you may be giving to your children. Follow-up studies on people who were started on stimulants as children show that they have shrinkage of brain tissue, measurable on brain scans. They have reduced height and weight. They're being incarcerated more often than other people. They're going to mental hospitals more often. Their suicide rate is increased. Every single one of these facts documented by follow-up studies of what happens to you if you get started on stimulants. And one particularly well-done study, the rate of cocaine abuse is greater when you become a young man or woman if you've been put on stimulants as a child. That's because the stimulant drugs such as Ritalin and Concerta and Adderall and Dexedrine, they're so similar to cocaine in their effects. All right, let's look at another group, the sedative, sleeping pills that you're taking like Sonata and Ambien, any one of the prescription sedatives used for sleep. We now got 2 or more good studies showing they shorten lifespan. You can Google them. You can Google practically anything I'm telling you, but you'll get more accurate and direct data from psychiatric drug withdrawal. Now, what about the benzodiazepines, the tranquilizers like Xanax and Valium and Ativan and Klonopin? They're very addictive. You know that people taking Xanax in controlled clinical trials, after a mere 6 weeks, a large percentage can't get off. After a mere 6 weeks, they become addicts to Xanax. Great for the drug business, great for your psychiatrist or prescriber who just wants to write prescriptions. Terrible for you. These drugs now, several studies show, like Xanax and Ativan, they're causing shrinkage of the brain too. Coming off them can be an absolute horror story. It can be harder to get off those drugs than to get off opiates. They leave people who try to come off of them with horrendous insomnia, horrendous anxiety, aches and pains in their body, such pain in their feet that they can't stand up, that it's just too much pain, weird feelings throughout their body, and then the realization as they come off that their minds aren't working as well, that they have memory loss for the past and have more trouble learning. Now, I know this is hard. You know, it's hard for me to even talk about it, but it's really time to face up to just how dangerous these drugs are. So we've looked at the stimulants and the sleeping pills and the benzos. Now the antipsychotic drugs, which are not really antipsychotic drugs, they're just lobotomizing drugs that are being given to some people for sleep, like Seroquel is being given to people for sleep, and Abilify and Latuda and Risperdal and Zyprexa. All of these drugs are very damaging to the brain. They virtually wreck a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. They cause a dreadful disorder, tardive dyskinesia. I've done a whole Simple Truth video about tardive dyskinesia. They're shortening the lifespan. We have evidence that people who are put on a lifetime dose of these antipsychotic drugs for whatever reason, whether it's to help you sleep at night or because that you're hallucinating and have a lot of problems, 20 years shortened lifespan. And we know some of the ways the lifespan's being shortened, because especially these newer antipsychotics, so-called second generation or atypical antipsychotics, they're even worse than the older ones in causing a metabolic syndrome. People get obese, they get diabetes, they get pancreatitis, they get elevated cholesterol, blood pressure is off. And then, since the drugs also cause heart arrhythmias and in combination with other drugs do even more cardiovascular damage, that's one of the ways in which people are having shortened lifespan on these drugs. The mood stabilizers, so-called, which are just emotionally flattening drugs. Most of them were originally anti-seizure drugs. The one we've studied for the longest time is lithium. If you stay on lithium for a lifetime, like your doctor tells you to, you're at grave risk of severe mental problems in the form of memory difficulties, learning new materials, conducting your affairs like you have your whole life. None of these drugs are good for your brain. All of these drugs are bad for your brain, and it shouldn't be any surprise. These drugs are producing multiple biochemical imbalances in brains that don't have any biochemical imbalance until a physician or prescriber puts you on the drug. Now please, don't just stop taking your drugs, because the ultimate tragedy is that coming off of them can be catastrophic. People can get suicidal, they can get violent. Some of the drugs you can get seizures. Some of the drugs can drop your blood pressure if you're coming off. So, get good information. I put everything I know about it in Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal. Get good information, get some good clinical supervision, work with your family or friends. The shorter time you're on psychiatric drugs almost certainly means that you'll have a better quality of life.
What are SSRI drugs?
Okay. That's the abbreviation for selective serotonin reuptake pump inhibitors, SSRI.
Whoa, that's a mouthful.
Mouthful. So SSRI is kind of an easy way to explain something that we doctors don't understand. So we get this propaganda from the drug industry representatives who come and give us samples and wine and dine us and don't tell us.
Really?
Yeah, that's right. And they don't tell us everything that we should know about using these very dangerous and addicting medications that alter the brain. If I had audiovisual aids here, this is a 3-hour lecture that I'm trying to summarize here. But those are chemical structures, small molecules that are able to get into the brain and into the cerebrospinal fluid, and then they alter what happens at the synapse, which is where everything happens. The connection between two nerves is where these things work. They disable the reuptake pump, which is a pore that sucks for instance, serotonin, in the case of serotonin reuptake pump inhibitors, back in to be recycled. Well, when the drug is in the brain, it prevents the serotonin from being recycled, meaning it's going to deplete it eventually, while it's overstimulating the the receiving nerve from this other serotonin nerve, you can see why I could use a diagram here.
Right, but you're getting more serotonin when you take
Only
the drug?
you're getting more serotonin only in the synapse.
Okay.
But because serotonin gets not 100%, but close to 100% recycling, it gets used over and over and over again when you're on the Prozac or the Zoloft or the Paxil or the Celexa or the Luvox. You're not getting that recycling effect, so temporarily you're getting more serotonin
right.
impulses on the receiving nerve, so you feel better for a while. But then because the serotonin gets eventually deficient, and it knocks off some of the receptor sites. Again, this is more easy to understand with the diagram. You're altering the brain at least long term, maybe permanently in some cases, but at least long term. So there are fewer receptor sites. You're getting depleted, running on empty on serotonin, which only comes from food, by the way. The only way to raise serotonin in the brain is to take a nutrient called tryptophan or 5-hydroxytryptophan. There's only two ways to actually raise total brain serotonin. The SSRIs only increase it in the synapse level, and that's temporary, with a lot of damage being done. So that's why there's the Prozac poop out concept. All those drugs poop out. They stop working after a month or so. And so then you have to raise the dose. And now you're getting even more aggravation, maybe a little more effect, but again, that's temporary. So,
But isn't that the typical pattern with all drugs, whether they're legal or illegal, that you have to take more to get the effect?
That's right. Yeah, that's true. And that's, they call that tolerance. The psychiatric term is tolerance. It works for a while, and then your body gets tolerant to it, and you lose its effect.
So you develop a tolerance for these drugs?
Yeah, so you have to increase the dose. And then if you try to quit, your brain now is dependent. That's where the dependency term comes. Your brain is dependent on the drug, and now you're going through withdrawal. You're craving, or something's wrong, and the only cure is to take another hit. So if you're a cocaine addict and you run out your supply, you're anxious. You're searching everywhere for a dealer to get some more cocaine, or if it's Ritalin, which is the same as cocaine, molecular structure-wise, you're wanting to get another prescription or go to the street. And if you're a Zoloft user and you run out of your Zoloft, and you're frantic to get another dose because you're withdrawing within a day or two or three of some of these medications. So yes, they are addicting. Everybody, if they take it for a short time, or if it's a low dose, or you're well nourished perhaps, and not on any other drugs, maybe you can take it for a few weeks or a few months and then quit cold turkey without a lot of withdrawal symptoms. But when you've been on it for a long time, or in high dose, or in multiple medications, it's highly likely that you're going to have terrible withdrawal symptoms that may make it impossible for you to get off, or very difficult to get off without going crazy from the withdrawal. We all know the picture of the heroin addict that they throw in a padded cell, and he just sweats and he vomits and he has pain and he's just miserable. And then he eventually, may get a little bit better, but he probably hasn't. That's not very good treatment. He needs to be slowly withdrawn. He needs to be well nourished. He needs to be hydrated. He needs to have some nutritional help. And yet, we despise heroin addicts. We despise codeine addicts. But we don't despise Zoloft addicts or Prozac addicts, do we? Or Ritalin addicts.
It's totally acceptable.
Yeah, it's the legal drugs. My best example, and I could show you the molecular structures of cocaine next to Ritalin, and the brain doesn't tell the difference. There's subtle differences there. One's synthetic and one's natural, but the brain can't tell the difference between the two. Yeah. Cocaine addicts prefer Ritalin if they can get it in a snortable form. It's a longer acting. You get the same high, same quick high as cocaine. Can't tell the difference. It lasts longer. So Ritalin is probably more dangerous than cocaine if you take it parenterally. Taking it by mouth, you don't get this sudden high. It doesn't go to the brain fast that way as it was injected or smoked or snorted. But long term, the dangers are probably quite similar. And yet, cocaine, you go to jail if you're on cocaine.
But you can write me a prescription for Zoloft and won't be prosecuted?
Right.
All right. Thank you.
The antidepressants that primarily affect serotonin can have profound effects on sexual behavior. These behaviors include interest, arousal, and orgasm. Some examples of these drugs are Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Cymbalta, Effexor, Lexapro, and Celexa. The magnitude of this problem is enormous. Right now, there's about 30 million Americans who are taking antidepressants. Studies show that of those 30 million people on antidepressants, about half are going to have an alteration in their sexual behavior. Of those people who have an alteration in sexual behavior, it's less studied, but there are indications that about half of those people will have persistent problems with sexual functioning even after they stop the drug. The commonest effect is for the drugs to delay or completely eliminate orgasm. Men may experience problems getting an erection, and women can have problems lubricating. These effects have been used by medical scientists. The drugs are being promoted in some cases as a treatment for premature ejaculation. Marty Kafka, a Harvard psychiatrist, has promoted the use of these drugs to reduce sexual impulsivity in sexual offenders. The problems can occur in any combination. A person can have a lot of interest in sex, but have no ability to get aroused or to have an orgasm. A person may have the ability to become interested and to be aroused, but still not have the ability to have an orgasm. Any one or all three of these aspects of sexual behavior can be altered by the drugs. To date, there's no antidote to the unwanted effects of these drugs on sexuality. There have been some sporadic reports of using drugs that promote dopamine in the brain or enhance testosterone, or some herbs as well. But none of this has been verified, and most of the people who try these various remedies don't have any beneficial effect. So what can you do? The most important thing you can do is to be educated. Be aware that if you do have unwanted sexual side effects from these drugs, that these side effects can persist long after you've stopped taking the drug. In this regard, you might want to stop taking the drug as soon as you have any indication of these sorts of sexual side effects. If you're already on these drugs and you've been on them for a while, you might not want to rush to get off the drugs because of the sexual side effects. The drugs have very serious withdrawal symptoms which can be disabling. Also, since the sexual side effects of these drugs can persist long after stopping the drug, you may not resume your usual sexual functioning even if you do stop the drug. The risk of the withdrawal needs to be weighed against the possible benefits of regaining sexual functioning.
The main kind of antidepressant that is the most popularly prescribed are the SSRIs. And these are medicines that increase serotonin transmission. And when you start to push on the doses of these SSRIs, you start to lose some sort of quintessential feminine things. I mean, first of all, it becomes much harder to climax, and it becomes much, much harder to cry. But you also see decreases in empathy, in sensitivity, in passion. The simple way of thinking about an SSRI is that you have two brain cells, and one is a pitcher and one is a catcher. So pitch, catch, pitch, catch. So this nerve cell is throwing serotonin across, and this one is catching it. What the medicines do is they block the recycling back into the pitcher. So, I'm throwing, some of this gets caught, some of it gets dropped, it just doesn't get over there, but I'll suck it back in and try again. So if you block the recycling, more is in the middle to get across. So there's more, the space between the nerve cells is called the synapse. If you block the recycling of the serotonin into the releasing cell, more is available for the catching cell. So it ends up enhancing the transmission. How enhanced serotonergic transmission translates into feeling better and feeling less anxious is much more complicated. But the simplistic way to think about it is that if you have higher levels of serotonin, if your transmission is better, you will be more relaxed and more happy. It's a little easier to smile, it's a little harder to cry. So, I've had patients come to me say, I've tried antidepressants before, but they always made me feel like a zombie, or they didn't make me feel like myself. Or, I had a patient who said, I cut my finger and I looked down and I saw that it was bleeding and I saw that it was my blood, but I didn't really feel connected to my finger or the blood. Things like that are really, really worrisome. Or I've had patients say, I was in the situation where I knew I should be crying and I couldn't cry, and I felt terrible that I couldn't express that emotion to, bond with my friend or something like that. So these antidepressants do scale back a lot of expression of emotion and feeling emotion, even sort of thinking emotional thoughts. If you're terribly depressed and you need antidepressants to get out of bed and function and go to work, I get it. That's one thing. But what I'm worried about is more and more women deciding to go on antidepressants because their friends are doing it, and that's what's, more and more women who are at work are taking these SSRIs so that they can not cry, not get flustered, keep going forward. I think it jibes with this sort of forward momentum agenda that so many of us have, and especially in the workplace. But, I would say, at what cost?